Thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, I have a distinguished guest, Jessica Nunn, joining me to discuss what it looks like to prepare your plastic surgery practice for sale. I'm your host, Joshua Swearingen. I've been in the healthcare space for going on 20 years, most of that in the executive space, either building and running dental service organizations, and then ultimately selling those off to private equity-backed organizations. I've spent stints in the M&A space, working for some of the largest consolidators in dentistry. I have now worked for TUSK for 3 years, and in my spare time, I am the founder and co-owner of Reverse Aesthetics, which is an aesthetics and med spa and anti-aging clinic in Columbus, Ohio. Yeah, okay. Interestingly enough, my first interaction with Jessica, and she probably doesn't even remember this, was at an AmSpa event about a year ago when I was first getting Reverse Aesthetics up off the ground. I went to do some reconnaissance and learn a few things, and I remember distinctly sitting in her course taking about 30 pages of notes as she taught me all the things that I needed to be tracking in the business that I was previously unaware of. So for that, I greatly appreciate your time and energy and willingness to come on the show. So
Yes, that's fun. Thank you.
yeah,
And thanks for having me today. I'm Jessica Nunn, as you mentioned, founder of Maven Financial Partners. And as you know, we are like the CFO for healthcare practices. About 65% of our business is aesthetics, plastic surgery, anything, related to the aesthetic side of healthcare. The other 35% is just dental, other general healthcare practices. But we definitely love this industry and this vertical. I started my career as a CPA preparing tax returns, and as you can imagine, that wasn't the most fun thing. So, we at Maven do not do that. What we do is we help businesses truly understand what's going on with their practice. So, we help them really uncover what is my revenue and why is this my revenue? Who's generating the revenue? What can I do to make more? We help them see what their expenses are. Where is my money going? What's the profitability and how can I improve that? For practices that have multiple providers, or even if there's just one, we set goals for the providers around revenue, patient capacity, patient volume, things like that. And really, we're just analyzing the data. So, as you know, there's a lot of financial and operational data available to practices. We help make sense of that and provide meaning around those numbers to the practice owner. One of the things that we do for every practice is we build a budget. So we really want to get clear about what practices can expect in terms of revenue and expenses, and then cash flow. Like, what should you expect in your checking account every month, and how much can you take out? What's your profitability? All the things. So that's really what we do. And I'm excited to have this time with you today because we are having a lot of conversations with our practices about what people are calling me wanting to buy my practice. What is that all about? So, I think that this will help a lot of our clients understand what in the world is going on in this space, especially with regards to acquisitions and things.
hey Jessica, just out of curiosity, when is an optimal time for a business to get involved in you? Are you primarily working with startups, or do you have a lot of business owners that have been running their business for a couple of years and are coming to you saying, "We don't know what's going on. Can you help
Both.
us kind of decode all of this?"
It's both. So it's some people who are like, I have an idea. Have you ever heard of a med spa, right? Or have you ever heard of a practice? We're like, yeah, 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 we'll help you with that. And then a lot of people will say, listen, I've been really successful, but like, I'm not exactly sure how or why, and I want to understand and continue that. Is it just a fluke, or is this like my new normal? Can I expect this success to continue? Or, I want to become even more successful. How do I do that? So we really help practices in all stages. I would say that most of our clients honestly they're not like, I for sure want to sell in 1 year, let me hire you. They're more like, I just want to understand what's happening. And then by way of their practice becoming more and more profitable, growing larger, becoming more successful, whatever it might be, then they happen usually to get, their doors knocked on or a letter in the mail. And that's where we're like, okay, well, now it's time to have this conversation. And so that's where we have been with some of them. But yeah, most of them, will help with startups, young practices, or folks that have been in business for quite a while.
Great, that's great. And how many team members do you have currently?
So we have 12. We have 6 consultants and 5 analysts. We are based here in Dallas, Texas, but have clients all over, and actually have a consultant where you are as well. So that's been fun. Hopefully you guys can hang out.
Yeah, I actually connected with him on LinkedIn the other day, and I think we're going to try to catch up and grab a drink sometime.
Awesome. Great.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you for that intro. I appreciate it. Just to give you a little bit of intro on Tusk, we are 14 fully dedicated team members. Most of us have some sort of a background in either investment banking, mergers and acquisitions, or private equity. We've been in the healthcare space for going on 8 years. We've handled well over $1 billion in healthcare transactions across numerous healthcare verticals. And as a nice little graphic of all the places that we've worked,
That's awesome.
isn't that cool? That's one of
Yeah,
my
I like
favorite
it.
graphics. What was that?
I said I like it. Hopefully everyone prefers their employment at Tusk the best,
We
right?
do.
But it is a lot of cool experience you guys are
We
showing.
don't we don't have turnover. They find their way here and we never leave. So we have a lot of fun. And
Awesome.
if you're ever out at trade shows or anything like that, we're one of the groups that you want to try to find because we're always having a good time as a group. So before we really dig into kind of preparing or taking a look at your plastic surgery practice and determining what needs to be done to get it ready to go to market, I just want to back up a little bit and talk a little bit about healthcare consolidation in general, because that's really what's driving all of these conversations. And I think if you go to any of the aesthetics show meetings or AmSpa or any of these, or listen to publications, or certainly our, this podcast, for instance, it's a significant topic that is being discussed almost everywhere, and that being private equity and its impact on the healthcare environment. And I think it's important to kind of step back and look at some of the industries that have consolidated before plastic surgery. And I think if we look at, medical consolidation, which has been going on for 30 to 40 years, maybe even longer than that, depending upon how far you go back, we are roughly 85 to 90% consolidated on the medical healthcare space. And the easiest way to think of that would be kind of your primary care physicians, or most of your health insurance driven spaces. And almost the entirety of that consolidation has now fallen underneath either universities or hospital systems, and that they own the lion's share of all the healthcare businesses that are going on. Now, if you fast forward a little bit, conversely, if you're looking at dental consolidation, dental is roughly 30 to 35% consolidated. And the interesting thing about that is we are now seeing that start to accelerate, and the move from 10 to 30 took about 15 years, and moving from 30 to 50 or 60% is likely going to occur in the next 7 to 10 years, largely because you now have a lot of consolidators in the space that are rapidly buying practices and even buying each other at this point. And I know that you guys operate in the dental space. I'm sure you have clients that you're talking to with regularity about what that space looks like. Am I correct?
Yeah, and I think even to backtrack even further, I want to make sure that everyone who's listening is super clear on what we mean by consolidation, because sometimes us financial people will say these words that non-financial people are like, what in the world are they talking about? So by consolidation, we mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, what we mean, a lot of different practices are now owned by one group or one person. So in the dental world, we kind of call that corporate, right? So practices are either considered private practice or corporate, and corporate just means that it's a multi-location owned by one group of people. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. Perfectly fair. And usually, to take that even further, it's usually owned by some sort of a private equity backed entity. So, and that is usually the driving force of the consolidation. But that's a great point that you just
I
made.
think it's great for us to kind of, break this up into layman's terms as much as we can. A lot of our clients, will come to us and say, okay, this is what they said. Like, what does this actually mean to me? And so I want to make sure that we're doing that. We're being, between the two of us, like we're really trying to break it down into. A lot of our clients will say, talk to me like I'm a kindergartner. Okay, like I can do that. That's my favorite thing to do. So I guess medical consolidation has happened for a long time, is what we're seeing here. Dental consolidation is newer, but happening rapidly. So are you then going to tell us that plastic surgery is well on its way? Okay, very
Yeah,
exciting.
absolutely. Plastic surgery is falling right in that 7 to 10% bucket, depending upon the metrics that you're measuring by. And I think that this is all really important for a couple of different reasons, and I'll get into those now. And I actually would love your feedback on some of this. And I think that when we're talking about consolidation lifestyle, and we're able to measure a lot of this because we've watched medical consolidation and we've watched dental consolidation. So the playbook is really pretty much the same because it's largely driven by private equity groups who have had experience doing this. So phase one, 0 to 10%, which is kind of where plastic surgery falls right now, is really the phase of platform development. And that's basically private equity coming in and saying, I don't really want to buy a single one location practice or maybe even a two location practice. I need to buy something substantive that has some level of infrastructure in place and something that I can build on and then ultimately build around. So they're looking for larger multi-location groups, 2 to 5 million in EBITDA, even north of that in many cases. And if you're sitting in that position right now, that is squarely where plastic surgery is presently. And they're active. There are private equity groups actively looking for these large platform investments at a very high valuation because they just want to get their business kind of off the ground so that they can then move into the private practice arena. Is that consistent with what you're seeing?
Well, you really know more about this than we do. I had not heard this, so this is really good information. So you're saying that the appetite at this point in the life cycle is going to be for people who kind of already have established that they know what they're doing, they have lots of locations, and they're already kind of scaled.
Correct.
That
Correct. Yeah.
makes sense, right? The private equity is like, I'd rather start with someone who's sort of done it before and knows what they're doing and kind of has a platform, and that's why we use the word platform. And then
Yep.
we'll kick it off from there and go around and acquire smaller practices.
100%. Yeah, they're really looking. I mean, this segment of it is very focused on the operators. How well can they go out there and efficiently operate a business? And can we, as the source of funding, trust them to continue running this business and then ultimately take all of these other smaller businesses that we're going to fold in and run those as efficiently? Because economy of scale and efficiencies are the entire reason that this is occurring and why these groups are doing it, because ultimately they want to build these groups larger and larger and then sell them off at a profit 5 to 7 years down the road.
Got it.
So I think that's squarely where we are right now. Phase two, which is where we're headed, and this is square, and we know this because this is where dentistry is right now, but this is really the golden age of private practice ownership. And this is where, you've had 3 to 5 years, 5 to 7 years, whatever it is, of platform development. We now have existing platforms, 5, 6, 7, 10, 20 of them, however many there are, and we've created a competitive environment for private practices. Previously, there weren't a lot of buyers looking for private practices because they're all looking for larger entities. Now, these larger entities are formed and they are actively looking for businesses to fold in. So this is where your clients come to you and say, "Hey, I'm getting letters in the mail. I'm getting
Yeah.
offers. People are calling me." That's why these businesses have been built and they are looking at businesses to fold in. And this is the perfect time for private practice owners to begin considering selling their business. And I think the one thing to be aware of, and this is kind of the downside of what this consolidation looks like, is, and dentistry is also starting to see this. At some point, you get so consolidated that those larger organizations that are already existing, they need bigger transactions to move the needle. So they become less interested in single locations and they start looking at acquiring much larger groups. So
Got it.
you may have a 40 or a 50 location group that is actively looking at adding pieces and parts to that group, but a small private practice that does $1 million in EBITDA with a few providers or whatever isn't enough for them. They would have to do too many of those to hit their investment goals for a year. So they're actively looking for 7 to 10 location groups or even 30 or 40 location groups out there to really impact their bottom line and move their business forward. And I think that that's that is, that is solidly 15, 20 years away in the plastic surgery space. But that's kind of that's a number to be aware of as you're looking at planning out over the next several years, because once we start to get to that point, you do see valuations for the private practices start to drop a little bit, and you've
Okay.
missed kind of that premium space.
So you're saying that we're in phase one right now with plastic surgery practices.
Yep, we're on the
And
tail end of it.
so we're about to get into phase two.
Yep,
So you're
yep.
saying get ready, and that's why we're here today.
That is exactly why we're here today. Yeah, and ultimately that's, I mean, the reason we know that is because we're starting to hear more and more from private practices that they are getting contacted by these larger groups. So
Okay.
the second that starts to happen, we know that there is a competitive environment out there. There are multiple active buyers looking to purchase practices, and they and there's an environment that is conducive for these businesses to sell. So, and that's why you're getting calls, and that's why we get calls. So,
Yeah, makes
right.
sense.
All right. So driving forces into plastic surgery. As we sit back and we look at this, you might be asking, well, why plastic surgery? Why is private equity being drawn to this space? And it's really a pretty easy playbook for private equity. They're looking for industries that are growing rapidly, that have patient stickiness, that have consistent returns, and perform well during down markets. So, if you look at the scalability of your business model, many of you have, one location, many of you have two, three, four locations. Jessica, I'm sure you work with clients that have multiple locations all over the place. And the reality is that once you have some of those systems and processes and the right management team in place, it really isn't that difficult to replicate that at another location, provided the market dynamics are reasonably similar. And private equity fully understands that and is banking on their ability to do that as efficiently or more efficiently than most private practices. One of the great things about the aesthetic space in general is patient stickiness. And many of you have membership programs. You provide med spa services that bring your patients back every few months. If you're a plastic surgeon, once you perform a procedure on a patient, if they're going to have subsequent procedures, they're very likely coming back to you. You're now offering laser treatments, which increase some of that patient stickiness. Private equity groups love to see patients that are coming back for repeat services. It's one of the reasons why dentistry has been such a popular target, because of those hygiene visits. But this is one of the spaces that has the highest percentage of consumer stickiness and consumer loyalty in healthcare, and it will always be a draw for private equity groups when you can see that. Projected market growth is 9% compound annual growth rate year over year for the next 7 to 10 years. That's astronomical, and that's barely scratching the surface of the rapid increase of patient demographics that are being touched. 10 years ago, your average patient was a 45, 50-year-old woman, 45, 50-year-old woman going in for various aesthetic services. That number is now decreasing into the 30s and will likely hit the 20s in the next 10 years. And we've now opened up an entirely new patient population in that men are now receiving services at a higher and higher percentage. And that's a market that hasn't even been remotely tapped until over the last couple of years. So we've got a rapidly expanding patient base that is only going to improve that 9% growth rate moving forward. So these are all reasons, and they're present in all of the aesthetic services, really. If you look at dermatology, if you look at med spa services, if you look at plastic surgery, you see a lot of these similar market dynamics present, and it's one of the reasons that you have private equity groups that are so active in that space, trying to build out groups. All right, so with all of that history lesson now done, we can actually get into the meat of tonight's topic, and that is, what does it look like to prepare your practice for sale? And I think that there are a bunch of topics, and I'm really looking forward to getting Jessica's feedback on some of this stuff. The first one I'll take: understanding the present market value of your business. And I think one of the things that we'll talk about at the end is, we do a free market evaluation for any plastic surgeon that's interested in trying to determine what the market value of their business looks like. We call it a TUSK val. There will be a QR code at the end. You're welcome to scan or give us a call. But what we essentially do is we run some basic financials for you, and we'll help determine, how we believe the market will see your business. And in turn, if it's ready to go to market and it hits all of the numbers that you're looking for it to hit, we can have a discussion about what that looks like. But in many cases, it doesn't. And then we want to sit down and figure out, all right, let's say that you're interested in potentially, exiting the business in the next couple of years. What needs to be done to get that business ready? And that really kind of takes us to the next point, which is understanding the profit drivers in your business. And Jessica, do you want to touch on that
Yeah.
for a second?
So, clients will ask us a lot too, just, hey, well, eventually I might want to sell. And they'll say things like, so I want to make my office really beautiful. And I'm like, well, you can do that. And that might attract a buyer. But the reality is that what drives the value of your business, correct me if you feel I'm wrong, is the profit, right? We talk about EBITDA, which truly is what investors look at in terms of profitability, in terms of the valuation, right? And EBITDA is truly just a fancy way of measuring your profit. So once we get through these topics, we're going to dive into a little bit more about how can we preemptively work on our profit? What should we be looking at in order to increase our revenue or decrease our expenses so that we can increase the profit of our business, which will in turn drive the valuation.
Yeah, and kind of piggybacking on what Jessica just said, I think it's, I'm going to jump down a point, but, you know, building out your team is a critical part of this process. And I think that, understanding what the value of your business is presently is critically important. And then understanding if it's not where you need it to be, what you can do to get it there is critically important. And I think that really lends itself to making sure that you're partnered with the right organizations that are going to help you make some of those strategic decisions along the way, and protect you throughout this process. And I think that it probably goes without saying that there's a huge financial component to this conversation, and much of that ultimately plays itself out in your personal financial situation. So understanding, if you're looking at partnering with a group, what do you need? What does your retirement look like? What do you need from a personal standpoint to make this transaction worth it for you? And I think that, when we consult with prospective sellers, to some extent, we're really actually surprised by how few of them have really sat down and figured out, what their number is. What do they need out of this transaction to live the life that they're looking to live moving forward? So I think having a little bit of an understanding of that is critically important. And then I think to close that out, we've touched on it briefly here, but beware of the unsolicited offer and a lack of competitive buyers. When you receive, a phone call or a letter from a potential buyer, you're putting them in the driver's seat, and they are in full control of every part of that transaction. And they are heavily incentivized to buy low and sell high, and that's nothing against them personally or as an organization. That's just how the business model is built. And if you don't have someone defending you at every step of the process, there will be significant amounts of capital that you will lose out on that you won't even realize it until it's too late. So with that, I really want to jump into a couple of slides from Jessica, and work through, what are some of these profit drivers within the business, and how do we look at, making improvements, or at least measuring what that profitability looks like.
So, when people ask us, how do we increase the profitability of our business? It shockingly comes down to two things, right? You can either increase your revenue or decrease your expenses, or sometimes you can do both. So, how do we work on maximizing revenue? And to be honest, we actually have a favorite. If we're going to talk with anybody about becoming more profitable, 99 times out of 100, we are going to start with increasing revenue. And I'm telling you guys as practice owners, that is the place to start for you. If you're looking at your expenses and you feel like you're spending too much money, and you feel like, cash flow is just bleeding, and everywhere you look, there's another bill, and you're paying all these things to all these people, You are, right? It could potentially be true, but you're likely to move the needle more by focusing on your revenue and understanding if you can maximize your revenue. It's going to have a much larger impact to your bottom line than worrying about all of your little expenses. So if you've got a limited amount of time, I know that you're busy, you own a practice, right? You're taking care of patients, you're doing a lot of things. So we always recommend starting with understanding your revenue and your revenue drivers before tackling your expenses, and just make sure you're optimizing your revenue. So, how do we optimize our revenue? Well, there's a lot of things that we can track in a practice to best understand how the revenue is being generated. We call these key performance indicators. They're really your financial key performance indicators. And really, you're, no matter which way you slice it, you're selling your time, right? So we like to track, even for plastic surgeons, revenue per hour, revenue per appointment, and capacity. And there are some other KPIs that I'm going to describe as we go, along too. So definitely have something to write with so you can write these down, because tracking these KPIs is going to allow you to truly understand why your revenue is what it is and how can you make that different? How can you increase that? So number one, we're going to start tracking our data. What do we track? Well, I would start tracking your revenue per hour for you as a surgeon, but then also if you've got any other providers who are providing any other services. If you do have some aesthetic services, non-surgical aesthetic services in the practice, track those as well. To the extent you can track your own revenue per hour, that would be helpful as well. And what is that? It's just your revenue earned. So your sales, your production, your charges, your billings, your collections, any of those factors are a factor of revenue compared to your total hours worked, your total hours that you're in surgery. Number two, revenue per appointment. Now this is going to be, you're looking at an average, because we know that some appointments, right, are a surgical case and some appointments are a follow-up or a consult. So you could track your revenue per your surgical case. That's another KPI that I'll talk about in a second. But definitely look at revenue on average per your appointment, especially if you have other providers. This is helpful for them as well. And then capacity. So this is just a function of how busy are you, right? It can be total hours worked over total hours available, or it can be, if you've identified the most amount of surgeries you can do in a week, how many did you do? How full was your schedule with cases? So you want to measure some form of these things: capacity, which is how busy you are; revenue per appointment, your average revenue per patient visit, the bodies that come in your office; and then revenue per hour. Now, other things that I would consider tracking in a plastic surgery office, especially if there is no aesthetic component. Like if you're truly just doing surgery and that is it, obviously you want to track your case volume. Okay, so you're going to track your case volume by month. Compare that to how many cases did you do in March of last year? How many cases did you do in March of the year before? You really want to understand the trend over time. Track your consults. How many consults did you do this month, last month, the month before, same time last year? And then track that consult to case conversion, right? If you saw 20 patients for a consult and you got 5 cases out of that, what is that ratio? Has it changed over time, or is it consistent for you? Now, if you're taking insurance, if you're doing restorative procedures or other procedures that, you're accepting insurance, there's more KPIs for you to track. So you'll want to check to really understand your adjustments, your insurance adjustments. So what are your gross charges? That's your charges at your own fee schedule. And then what are you actually able to collect on those cases based on what insurance that you can pay? Those are your net charges. The difference between those are called your contractual adjustments. So I know this is a lot, but track that as well. And then of course you want to track your collections, which is what you're actually paid, right, from the patients or from the insurance company. And then if it were me, right, and for our practices we do this, I like to track all those data points per case. So you'll have what are your gross charges per case? What are your collections per case? What are your net charges per case? What's your adjustment rate, right? We're looking at a lot of practices who, their revenue is less and they're like, why is my revenue less? I'm doing the same number of cases. Well, you're doing more insurance cases, or for some reason, insurance is not paying as well in these cases. Why is that? Right? But if you're not tracking all these data points, then you don't know why your revenue is less. You're just going to work harder and not understand why you're generating less revenue. So the three best ways to increase revenue, right? It comes down to time. You're either going to um, work more hours, right? Or do more cases. That's going to increase your revenue per hour. You're going to streamline your appointments so that you are maybe doing more production per visit. And then you're going to work on your capacity. So close the gap between the number of cases you can be doing and the number of cases you are doing.
Jessica, I'm just curious, when practices come to you, how many of them are actually tracking some of these metrics?
Oh, some of them are. Some of them
Okay.
really warm my heart, and I'm very impressed with them. On the first call, they say, "Oh, we've been tracking this stuff. We know our cases." I would say, to be honest with you, so in general, our practices, right? Med spa, dental office, general physician, surgeons, most people are not tracking any of this. And I'll say, okay, well, what's your, revenue per hour? How much are you doing when you're in surgery? And they're like, I don't know, right? But some practices really are able to identify at least their case volume, their consults, their conversion. Maybe they're really good at tracking new patient phone calls. Like we're tracking something and we're trying to get some semblance of information. So
Sure.
it's just number one, what do you do with it, right? How often are you looking at it is a lot of it, right? Like they'll say we're tracking it. I'm like, well, did you look at it? Well, I looked at it last year, so how often are you looking at it? How are you looking at it? What are you comparing it to? And the beauty with us too is we've got a lot of practices. So, a lot of the question is, well, what's normal? What can I expect? What are other people doing? Are other people having declining revenue right now? What's going on?
Mhm.
So, I will say that number one, certainly track it, but do something with that information.
Sure. And when you so when you're helping to set these practices up, are these when they're tracking these metrics, are these things that are built into most of their practice management software, or are these things that you're kind of helping them set up and doing manually?
Great question. So, what we do is we dive into the practice management software. So if a client is on like Nextech or Patient Now, we're going to get access to that and pull this because um, it is not often easy to pull this data
Mhm.
from the software. Like our team is really good at diving in and understanding exactly what reports to use so that we can extract this data. Now, obviously, it's fairly easy for a practice sometimes to identify their cases, right? They can even look at the schedule, their case volume, or identify their phone calls, their consults, things like that, just by keeping up with it on the schedule. But if you want to get into the nitty gritty of the data, you have to be using your software well, and we really like to dive into that and identify that for practices. I think that's a lot of where the value comes in for us because that's a lot of labor intensive work, and your office managers doesn't have time for it. You definitely don't want to do it. So we really like to dive in there and identify opportunities even to use the software better.
Yeah, that's great. So you help them get all of the tracking set up, and then you set up quarterly meetings with them or
We
annual
do it every
meetings
month. So we are
per month.
going to
Okay,
make you look at your information every single month, whether you like it
great.
or not, but you're going to like it. But it is really nice to look at the data and to, know where you're tracking, know where you're trending, understand where you've been and where you want to be going. And I think the key too, when you have this information and you know what you did last year and you know what you're doing this year, then you can best understand, well, what can I expect, right? What could I do next year? And what do I need to tweak in order to generate that revenue goal so that I can get the valuation that I need, so that I can hit that retirement number that I need, so I can end up on a beach, in 10 years or whatever the plan is.
Yeah.
So we're really working backwards to design the revenue to be in line with what your practice requires to generate the profitability that your practice should have, or just to maximize based on the people that you've got, your team and the other providers, what should it be? So building that plan is our favorite thing. The data is one thing, but like if you just look at it and you're like, map is what it is, right? Then that's one
Sure.
thing. But if you can take it and say, all right, listen, well, if we were to maybe spend a little bit more on marketing based on how well we convert our consults, then maybe we'll get more consults and we can convert them better. And maybe we need to invest in a little bit of training to
Yep.
to convert these consults better. Or maybe we need to figure out a new patient financing solution, one that allows more patients to say yes. Or maybe it's time that I do hire somebody else, whether it's a PA to help with the surgeries or help with my practice, or maybe it is time to hire a nurse injector or something that can help generate other revenue in the practice that isn't done by me as the practice owner.
Sure. It's a great point. We're going to actually touch on that a little bit more later. So, but I don't want to jump ahead too fast. So,
That's fine.
so we have obviously maximizing revenue, and the flip side of that is going to be managing your expenses.
Yep, exactly. So, maximizing revenue is exciting, right? And when we are
Very
able to
exciting.
see practices grow that top line, that's exciting. But we all know it's not what you make, it's what you keep. So
Mhm.
how do we, really look at our expenses once we've got our revenue optimized? How do we make sure that, that we're keeping as much of it as we should? So there are really four key expenses that tend to get out of whack with practices. So we like to focus on these first. Again, we want to focus on the things that are really going to move the needle, right? Like, I know a lot of times we'll get calls for my Spotify. Should I be paying for Spotify? It just seems a lot, right? $20 a month. Stop worrying about that. Let's look at your payroll, right? You're going to move the needle there. So when we look at payroll, and you guys, practices are struggling in a lot of ways with payroll right now. As you know, last year, I would say the issue was finding people. We couldn't find anybody. It was so hard to find people. I do feel like that has somewhat resolved a little. I'm not hearing that as much lately. I feel like we're okay, the market has maybe corrected, or we're able to find the people that we need, but they sure want a lot of money. They sure want a lot of money. So, how do we control our payroll costs? Well, it's a couple of things. One is compensation methodologies. I'm going to skip to the bottom here. Oftentimes we hire people and especially if they're providers, we promise them a certain compensation methodology that might not actually make sense with the practice. And this is really hard to change once they've been working with you for 2 years and you realize that you can't be as profitable as you'd like because you're paying some of your providers way too much. So let's definitely make sure that we have conversations with, attorneys, with your financial team before we design compensation packages that you may not be able to afford. So, we're working on that a lot right now with clients. How can we design a compensation package that makes sense for everybody?
Mhm.
But usually with payroll, it is not a function of we have too many bodies. That's almost never the case because we can't find these bodies. So how can it be that we're overstaffed? It's almost never overstaffed. It's also rarely that we're just paying people too much. I feel like most practices have a pretty good idea of what the market rate is for their team members. They know what they need to pay people to keep them. So typically, what we find, strangely enough, is that when we go back to the revenue problem, right, and we're identifying how can we maximize revenue, how can we get these KPIs to be better, and we know the practice can generate more revenue, if we're able to streamline some of these things, then as it turns out, our payroll is fine. Our payroll numbers are in nice alignment when we're generating the revenue that our practice can generate based on the providers that we have. So in that case, it's not a payroll problem, it's a revenue problem. It goes
Mhm.
back to the revenue. Rent is kind of the same, right? Obviously, it's going to be different. Our practices in middle of nowhere, Texas are going to have a different payroll or rent expense than our practices in Beverly Hills. So we definitely, it's going to depend on your location. But typically, our rent is too high when what? When our production, when our
Well,
revenue is not high enough to support it.
mhm.
So we've really got to make sure that our capacity is filling our space, right? If we've got 10 treatment rooms, do we have enough providers? Are we bringing in enough patients to support that rent? So that comes back to a what? Revenue problem.
Mhm.
So isn't it interesting that our two biggest areas that we can get out of whack all come back to revenue? This is why we focus on the revenue first. Number three, marketing. I will tell you, most cases when we're looking at practices and their marketing spend, we actually recommend they increase it.
Right.
So most practices, I will tell you, are spending too little on marketing in our opinion. And again, probably it's because we're trying to get them to drive more revenue to support the other costs. So we're like, get after it with your marketing, right? We need to have more patients in here. But really, in reviewing your marketing, of course, we like it to be, in line with your what the practice can afford.
Mhm.
But certainly we want to measure the ROI, measure the cost per acquisition. What are we spending? What are we getting? So there's some things to look at for marketing.
When you're breaking down the ROI, are you are you getting as granular as profitability by procedure? So,
No, we really don't. What we do is we look at cost of acquisition with marketing and we look at the spend as a percentage of income. And then we really just want to make sure that we're hitting our revenue goals. So if we're spending a ton on marketing, but we're still not driving those consults or the new patient visits or whatever it is, then we're going to want to have a conversation, with the practice and maybe the marketing team and figure out what's going on. Sometimes the marketing spend and the marketing services are doing great, but maybe the calls aren't being answered right, or maybe there's something happening there. So there's a lot that can be happening, but we want to definitely like get the whole team involved as far as all the service providers. Who's your marketing team, the financial team, and see if we can identify what's working, what's not working.
yeah, I have actually an example of that. When we first got started, we put a lot of money into the marketing side of things, and we grew relatively quickly. But we realized relatively early on, and it was just pure happenstance. I happened to pull a phone report from our phone provider and realized that we were missing like 40% of the phone calls that were coming in, and it was an almost immediate hire of a second front desk
Yeah.
person because we were pouring money into marketing. We had patients calling in that just couldn't get through because we didn't have the capacity to handle it.
Isn't that crazy? And
Hey,
and what a waste, right? You're spending all this
yeah,
money, the marketing is working beautifully, yet you might be saying, where are all these patients? So you
yeah,
really have to figure out if something is broken, where is
yeah,
it?
yeah. Where's the bottleneck?
Where is it?
Yeah.
Supplies. So supplies, as you guys know, at least those of you who are performing injectable services, man, these suppliers, they raise their fees every single year, right? You're going to pay more for these supplies every single year. So number one, what do we do to combat that? We have to raise our own fees, right?
Mhm.
We just have to do it. If you can't beat them, join them. But really on the supply side, you're people are buying things left and right, right? We don't know what's getting ordered. We there's no oversight. So really we've got to put in an inventory system. We should be tracking our inventory, especially if we're doing retail sales. We need to know, what we have on hand. We always recommend just one person needs to be in charge of ordering. They know what you have, they know what you need, and I'll tell you the practices that have the best supply margins, say, what the heck are you doing? Are you stealing? Like, what's happening? How are you getting your costs so low? And they'll say, man, that Mary, she is she is going to shop around. She's not just going to order whatever. She is crazy to identify the best place to get these supplies. So, there's usually that one personality in the office who can really stay close and watch the supplies. So get that person to do it.
Got it. When I first got into the healthcare space in dentistry, I was in sales, and I did not like Mary at all. She was annoying.
No, right?
Yeah,
Exactly. I mean, that's what we hear, but this is going to depend on your mix too. Like, what are you
sure.
doing? And a lot of people, listen, I'm hearing some people, I don't love this. They'll say, well, I'm overbuying because, the rates just get better. Like when you buy more, it's cheaper. And I'm like, yeah, but when you buy too much, it's not cheaper. You really have to make sure you're not overbuying. Or I have heard recently too, I just have a great relationship with my supply rep. Well, that doesn't mean that we buy stuff we don't need. Okay, so we're not friends. We still need to make sure that we're not buying too much.
We regularly run transactions, and I'll have conversations with doctors, and they'll say, I love my supply rep. I'm getting the best discount in the area, the biggest discount in the area. I'm like, all right, sure. I'm sure you are. I'm sure you are. And then we get partway into the analysis, and it's not even close. And the doctors are mortified by how much they have been paying year over year over year for these supplies when they finally either become a part of a group and see what their pricing structure is, or we kind of point out how out of whack their overhead is on their supply categories.
Yeah, same, same.
Interesting conversation. So,
So of course, which is better, right? Increasing revenue or managing expenses. If you have limited time and you're like, Jessica, I can't do all this. Okay, start with your revenue. Track your KPIs, make sure you're maximizing your revenue. Once you get there, that's probably going to fix your payroll and your rent, right? Then you can dive into some of these other things. So the best answer is to do both, but I get it. You're busy. This is a lot we're asking you to do. So start with the revenue.
when you're talking about the revenue categories, especially for, let's say a pure play plastic surgeon, are you getting into conversations of additional services they could offer, maybe opening up med spa services? Because, a lot of the surgeons they only have so much capacity they personally can handle, but many of them have facilities that are not booked out all the time and have plenty of available capacity. Is that a conversation that ever comes up?
Yeah, sometimes, it can be, but it really just depends on the personality. Like some people are like, I don't want to manage anybody else. I kind of like it like this. I don't want to manage anybody else.
Sure.
And some others are really open to expanding the services that their practice offers. So I think it really just depends on personality and the goals of the practice owner.
So as we move on, let's just talk about a few factors that can dramatically impact your exit value. And we look at these all the time, every single day. There are a myriad of potential things that can have an impact on what that value looks like. But I want to call out a couple of them specifically because we do find these in plastic surgery businesses somewhat regularly. And the first one is key man risk, and this is probably one of the biggest issues that we run into in plastic surgery mergers and acquisitions, because so much of the business is built around a single surgeon. So when you're looking at a transaction, the buyers, their number one goal, or not the number one goal, their number one focus at the front end is risk mitigation. They want to make sure that as they're looking at buying this business, let's say something happens to that doctor, they're able to maintain that EBITDA and that revenue, even in the midst of potentially a doctor going ill or something happening or something like that. So one of the things that we see with plastic surgery businesses is key man risk. And when we're talking to surgeons, and as we're having these conversations on podcasts and things like that, one of the things that you can be aware of is that if you're looking at for a premium value for your business, either having an additional surgeon in the business helps defray a lot of that risk. Incorporating med spa services as additional sources of revenue, or laser services or esthetician services as additional sources of revenue, help defray some of that key man risk if you're the primary surgeon in there. So that's one of those things to be aware of as obviously if you're looking at potentially selling short term, that you may not be able to make those changes right now. But if you're looking out into the future and you're building a business that ultimately you want to receive a premium valuation on, that is just something to be aware of as you're evaluating your business, or as we're going through a profitability analysis or a market analysis. The second thing is technological updates. Most of these private equity backed organizations are very technologically savvy. They're not interested in buying businesses that are operating in the Stone Age. They want businesses that are aesthetically updated. They want businesses that are technologically updated. That does not mean that you need to go out and buy every bell and whistle that all of your sales reps try to sell you. But it does mean that there are areas of the business um, that do need to have some technological attention paid to them. And I think probably the easiest example of this is actually in dentistry. And it's become relatively standard of care to have a cone beam for certain specialties within oral surgery or periodontics, or even some levels of general dentistry. And that's a really easy thing to look at, because most of the buyers out there want to make sure that you're taking proper care of the patient, you have a cone beam, you're taking the right scans, diagnostics, all of that kind of stuff. So for those practices that don't have something like that, it's either an immediate investment that the buyer has to make in the business, or they're just not going to be interested in that business in general, because they understand that that doctor is not providing the standard of care that is traditionally accepted within the space.
Can I ask you if this relates to if a practice has an OR?
Sure, sure. I mean, are you talking about an OR that's housed within the business
Yeah,
versus
like, if
versus?
they don't have an OR and they have to go to a hospital somewhere, is that going to impact the value? Obviously, like an accredited OR within your practice is worth something, right? And you're getting the
Yep.
facility fee on that. It may or may not be driving a lot of the EBITDA, but is that going to impact like the buyers? Are they going to be more interested in something like that?
I would say you're actually going to get mixed responses to that to some extent, because some of the buyers are actually going to see having an OR within the business as a risk, and they
Interesting.
would they would almost rather see that freestanding operating room that you're essentially renting space from, and you're renting the anesthesiologist as a defrayment of that surgical risk. So I think you'll have some buyers that would do that. Ambulatory surgical centers and surgery centers in general are actually a hot target of private equity right now. So there are also private equity groups that would look at that and say, from a 1,000-foot view, okay, this business is large enough and it has its own freestanding OR within it, I can buy four other plastic surgeons around there, and I have an OR that is available that can be used that I already own. So
Yeah.
it really depends on the risk profile that the private equity group. I guess the easy answer is yes and no. Some will look at it as a greater risk. Some will see that as a tremendous value.
Some kind of like when you're selling your
Yeah,
house and you say, but it
yeah.
has a pool. Well, some people do,
Right,
some people don't. Okay.
right, right. You're exactly right. And I think that really kind of lends itself to the importance of running a competitive process and making sure that you're being introduced to multiple buyers out in the space, because every buyer is going to look at different pieces and parts of the business differently, and they're going to value them differently, and you want to make sure you find the buyer that looks at that and says, wow, that's a tremendous asset, I am willing to pay up for that. Continuity of revenue and profitability. We talked about that briefly earlier on, but membership programs are critically important. Anything that helps improve the stickiness of the patient, bringing those patients back, um, points programs, referral programs, things like that. If those are well defined within your business and can be easily illustrated to the prospective buyer, you will receive value for that on the positive side. Whereas if they start digging into the numbers and there is significant patient turnover and you're not seeing a lot of those patients coming back for repeat services and things like that, they're going to look at that as a negative, not just because you're going to have to spend more marketing to bring in new patients, but because there's something going on within the business that is not maintaining those patients ongoing. So that's obviously a key indicator of the health of the business. And then market demographics. And this is not a disparagement of practices that are rural or practices that aren't in, tier one cities like Miami and Chicago, New York, and Beverly Hills and things like that. There's plenty of value in other cities, but trying to make sure when you're building out your business that you're in an attractive area of town, that you have signage and frontage that people can see as basically free marketing, that the demographics are going to support the business that you're building. Jessica mentioned it earlier, there's a big difference in rent between the middle of Texas and Beverly Hills. Absolutely correct. There's also very likely a big difference in the level of services that those patients are going to be looking for, and very likely the cost of the services they're going to be willing to pay for. So there has to be some coordination of that, and most of the buyers out there are going to be looking for businesses that are within market demographics that will sustain those businesses for a long time to come. So that kind of brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. Jessica, do you have any parting comments that you'd like to send our way?
No, I was just going to say I learned so much today. Thank you for
Likewise.
allowing me to participate in this with you.
Likewise. It was awesome to have you on. Thank you so much for your time. Do you want to give a plug for your free profit
Yeah.
assessment, or what that how some of the people would take advantage of that?
Yep, exactly. So if you are wondering how your expenses stack up, or if your revenue is enough to absorb the cost of your practice, and how you might align with other practices, and scan this QR code. We'd love to do a complimentary profit assessment. We would just send you some emails and request your 2023 financials for that. So that's all you need for that. And then here's how you can reach me, and check out our website, mavenfp.com. And we also are pretty active on Instagram. Maven Financial is our handle there. So hopefully we'll see you guys there, or we'll be able to have some conversations around a profit assessment.
So awesome. And if you haven't seen her, she's at almost every one of the meetings and shows. She's easy to find. For our part, you're welcome to either get a hold of myself, call the phone number, or scan the QR code on the screen for a free practice evaluation. It's very similar to Jessica's. We'll pull some basic financial information and practice management information, and then it takes us a few days to put it together. And we'll actually give you essentially an idea of where we believe your practice would fall in the marketplace today, given your current state. And I think between both of those assessments, you can have a really good roadmap of where you want to go next with your business. So again, thank you for joining us this evening. We're thrilled to have you on, and we will see you next time.